I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch. And it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. To be an airline pilot, there was mandatory age 60 retirement. I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous.
My sister-in-law started this program, and she gave me a set of qualifications for today's program. She said, I want you to have a naval aviator who was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, a decorated fighter pilot, and I want him also to be a graduate of the Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, and I want him to be a graduate of the Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, and I want him to be a Navy captain, and I also want him to be an astronaut and head of the astronaut program, and I also want him to be a race pilot who flies race airplanes at Reno. And then she said, oh, by the way, I want him to be an airline pilot too. So, naturally, I thought of Hoot Gibson. Where are you, Hoot? There he is. And you know what? She didn't think I could find somebody that fulfilled all those qualifications, and he's the only guy in the world that does. So, thanks for coming, Hoot. Okay, I got to know. A question everybody here wants answered. What's it like to be up in the space shuttle and look back on the Earth?
Well, gee, that's kind of a big question. But, you know, a question I used to get is, well, what's the best part about flying the space shuttle? Is it the launch? Is it the being on orbit part? Or is it the re-entry and the landing? And I always used to just answer yes. It really is an amazing experience, and it's kind of hard to top, I'm afraid, with just about anything else that you would ever try to do. And so when people would say, what are you going to do when you're done being an astronaut? I used to say, well, for excitement, I used to say, well, I don't know, maybe air racing. Maybe I'll get to do some of that. But the experience of flying in space is obviously spectacular. You have this ride up to orbit that takes you 8.5 minutes from liftoff to orbit, 8.5 minutes, and at the end of that 8.5 minutes, you're going 17,500 miles an hour. So if you think about that, that's better than 2,000 miles an hour each minute. So what a ride. It's hard to top that. I've never been in a Corvette that's anywhere close to that fast, even a Corvette. But and then you get up there and you get to enjoy this view that you have from 200 miles up. 200 to 300 miles up is where we fly the thing. You get to enjoy that view for 7-10 days. And then, I know I'm taking kind of long to answer a very simple question.
No, you take as long as you want.
The re-entry and the landing are pretty spectacular as well, because during the re-entry, you're going to fly surrounded by fire for 15 minutes. And all you can see out any of your windows is fire and flame all around you, all the way through that whole 15 minutes. And I'll never forget, on my very first re-entry, which was aboard Challenger, as the fire started to die out, which was at Mach 10 times the speed of sound is where the fire starts to die out. I remember looking out the window, and you could finally start to see things outside through the fire, thinking to myself, I can't believe that anything man-made can fly through this kind of an environment and survive. And so it's very impressive. Each time you get to see it, it's extremely impressive to see it. So like I say, kind of a long answer, but yeah, what a thrill. What a thrill.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about this airplane behind you, this Hawker Sea Fury. What lessons did you learn from test pilot school and from being in Top Gun that you can apply to air racing?
I guess what I'd say, Dan, is that from Top Gun, some of the things that you learn there are very dynamic and challenging environments that you put yourself in. And of course, you start out very gradually. Your very first dogfight in Top Gun is a 1 versus 1. And my very first one, who do they send me out against but Duke Cunningham, the Navy's first MiG ace. First MiG ace of the Vietnam War. My first one-on-one was against Duke Cunningham. And I think I saw him right at the beginning of the dogfight, and then that was it. He was behind me the whole rest of the time, as I recall. But you gradually worked your way up to more and more complex fighting scenarios, dogfight scenarios in Top Gun. And your last graduation exercise was about a 10-on-10. So I guess some of the things that I feel I learned is handling a very, very dynamic situation, being able to manage your airplane and keep an eye on your airplane and what is it doing, how much fuel have I got, are the engines running okay, are the temperatures okay, and those sorts of things while you're in the midst of a multi-plane environment. And that's exactly what air racing is like.
Well, situational awareness, I think, the fighter pilots
I guess we'd call that situational awareness as well. And from test pilot school, I'll just say real briefly, because I know I'm talking too much here, but the test pilot school teaches you absolute precision, because if you're after a data point, you have to be right at that data point. You have to have everything set up. And on the race course, when you're trying to make this thing go fast, and it does go pretty fast, you want that ball right in the center. You don't want any side slip. Believe it or not, at 400 miles an hour, I have a yaw string on the cowling up here. I think it's still sitting on there right now, but I have a little yaw string to make sure that I've got it trimmed up and have the ball right in the center, because you don't want any yaw when you're racing.
What would your instrument cross-check be in the middle of a race? What are you looking at, just temperatures or?
Well, yeah, I tell you, this is a fun airplane to manage in a race because there's so much to look at. In a way, it kind of reminds me, I've never driven a locomotive, but it must be like driving a locomotive. It's got steam gauges all over the cockpit, and they're spread out all over the place. And some of the things you have to watch. You've got to watch your oil pressure, of course. You've got to watch oil temperature. And this airplane has a modified engine in it. It has a 3350, a Wright Cyclone is the engine, replacing the original Bristol Centaurus. With that big engine, the oil cooler of the stock airplane is not big enough to handle that engine. So we have a water spray bar that sprays water, and you can see it in this wing, in the leading edge. We spray water on the cooler, and you've got to keep an eye on your oil temperatures. You also have to watch induction temperature while you're racing. And to help control the induction temperature, we have anti-detonation inhibitor. I guess that's what ADI stands for. We have water methanol injection that we use while we're racing. So you're wanting to watch your water methanol pressure and also your induction temperatures. Now, there's too many things to look at everything at once. So what I will do in the course of a race, when I've got a second that I can come back in the cockpit, I'll pick one of them. And you're running around that race course at 50 feet above the ground at 400 miles an hour with 8 other airplanes sometimes. And so you've got to be watching that very dynamic situation as well. So what I'll do is I'll pick one, and I'll come in the cockpit, get that one, and say, okay, it's all right, and then back outside. And then a couple seconds later, I'll come back in and grab another one. I suppose it's intuitive. You can't spend a whole lot of time in the cockpit while you're doing that.
When you're going around the pylons at 400, 450 miles an hour, how many G's are you pulling when you make that turn?
You know, it used to be the impression that when you were turning, you were pulling 5 and 6 G's. The problem with that is, as we all know, you're going to bleed speed if you're pulling too many G's. So what I try to do is project a nice smooth track around the course and pull 3 to 3.5 G's. And in some cases, there will be a pylon. Pylon number 2 is one example. It basically winds up being a non-pylon. You don't care about number 2. If you pass too close, if you were to pull hard enough to pass close to pylon number 2, you're pulling too hard. So what I do is I float 1 to 3, pulling about, like I say, 3 to 3.5 G's, because otherwise you're just going to load the airplane up too much and you're going to slow it down.
So you're more or less in a constant turn. You never really flying straight and level at all.
There are 2 spots on the unlimited race course where you will actually be wings level, and the unlimited race course is 8.47, basically 8.5 miles long. There's 2 places. One of them is going to the northwest. When you've made it around pylon number 3, you're going up over a ridge line, and you're heading, mostly north, but somewhat northwest. That's a bit of a straight line until you hit pylon 4. The other place is after pylon number 6 and down what we call the Valley of Speed. And in that case, that one's fun because you're actually coming downhill a little bit down the Valley of Speed. You are wings level. It's your chance to unload a little bit and pick up some real smash, because right after that, you're going to hit the home straightaway down the runway, And so you're going as fast as you're going to be going when you come by the crowd. And so those are the two straightaways that you'll actually get to go wings level for some period of time.
Okay, let's assume that I put an adrenaline meter on you. Okay, I got an adrenaline meter. Okay, which is it going to peg out at? On a night carrier landing, or a blast off of the shuttle, or going around the race course with 4 or 5 other airplanes in close proximity? Where is that adrenaline meter going to peak out?
Jeez, wow. Well, you know, it's hard to pick out which one of those is the best. I guess sitting on the launch pad when the clock gets to 10 seconds and counting, and you're sitting on top of, what is it, 4.5 million gallons, 4.5 million pounds of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and you're waiting for those things to launch, to light off so that you can launch, that's probably the one. Although, you know what, the other ones you mentioned, Dan, are awful close. Those are awful close as well.
Does anybody have a question for Hoot? Come on, I know somebody's got a question.
Several people, as we were sitting down, were commenting on the same thing, so I thought I'd be the bold one to ask. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how you can get away with the size of the annular inlet for that engine and not overheat it instantly? Thank you.
You bet, yeah, and that's a very good question. When we started racing this airplane, which was 1998, and I lucked out completely to get to race the airplane because the owner, Mike Mullane, who is sponsors the airplane, Orthosport is his company. He flies it, and he flies it very well, and I think he flies it better than I do, but fortunately for me, his wife won't let him race it, so I get to race the thing. We started out the first year with a much smaller spinner on the airplane, and it had quite a bit more air opening, I'm guessing about this large was how large it was. And what we would find out racing the airplane, our big challenge was keeping the oil temperature under control. And again, as I mentioned, we had the water spray bar to help us with that. The cylinder head temperature has never been an issue racing this airplane. In fact, most of the time we could not get it hot enough on the cylinder head temperatures. About as much as we'd see in a race would be 150 degrees, 170 degrees centigrade of cylinder head temperature. Well, shucks, that's nothing. You'd hardly even be able to fry an egg on your cylinder head if you were running that cool. So that tells you that you certainly can cut down the amount of air that you've got coming in. And what you see now is a carbon fiber spinner that obviously is a whole lot bigger than what the old spinner was, and it cuts that opening down. Even with that, I still have never seen more than about 180 degrees on the cylinder head temperatures. So it runs amazingly cool, you're right, for such a small opening.
How many horsepower are you pulling with the water injection?
With the full rated power of the engine with water injection, we're running 3,100 horsepower. The stock engine, the Bristol Centaurus, which had a 5-bladed propeller, and so when you see a Sea Fury with a 5-bladed prop on it, that has the Bristol Centaurus, and of course it turns the wrong way. The British make the engine turn the wrong way. And you know, when I first started flying it, I checked out in a 2-seater that had the Bristol Centaurus in it, and I thought, oh man, I'm going to be pushing on the wrong rudder. I'm going to add power for takeoff, you know, and you're going to push the wrong rudder and you're going to be right off the runway, just like that. What's funny about it is we pilots are just going to push whichever rudder you need. And so it's intuitive, it's very straightforward. It was a real surprise. The Bristol Centaurus, though, had, I think it was 2,400 horsepower, I think is what the stock engine had in this airplane. So this gives us another 700 horsepower with the right cyclone. So it's a nice engine change to make. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah.
I could just ask here. Here, how everyone can hear. What's your, just review your indicated airspeed as with this aircraft when you're going around the course in a normal situation.
Okay, yeah, the question is the indicated airspeed that you see. Now the airspeed indicator is in knots, And most of the time, well, all of the time, when we quote times for the Reno Air Races and your time around the course, we're going to quote it in miles per hour. And partly because I think that sounds better, you know, because there's more of them.
Bigger numbers.
Yeah, bigger numbers. It makes bigger numbers. But the fastest that we have ever gone with riffraff was in the 2003 Unlimited Gold Heat final. And I averaged 428 miles an hour for the 8 laps. Averaged that for the 8 laps. So, and we started out the first year we raced at 383 miles an hour. So we've improved it quite a bit over the years. To get to your real question, the indicated airspeed is running 340 to 360 knots of indicated airspeed. And of course, you're up at, let's see, Reno Stead is 7,000 feet density altitude. So, of course, you're going to indicate quite a bit less than what your true speed is, obviously. So, anyway, in that range, 340 to 360.
340 in a turn?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, you're showing it bleeds hardly at all, believe it or not, in the turns. Once you get this big, heavy moose going, it really keeps its speed up pretty well, especially if you're keeping the Gs down, keeping it to 3.5 Gs. You're really not going to see much difference in the turns. The fastest indicated airspeed you will see in the whole race is down that same valley of speed that I was referring to, where you're unloaded, you're going downhill, you got everything all nice and trimmed up. That's where you're going to see the highest indicated airspeeds.
Would you talk a little bit about your race strategy, about, you know, if someone's leading, what you do, if you're leading, what you do?
Sure, Dan. Well, our race strategy with the engine is full throttle. On the start, you know, you'll hear about the Mustangs do it a little bit differently, and of course they are running. We're basically running rated power. We're running 3,100 horsepower, which is what the engine is rated for. Now it's rated for, I think it's 5 minutes at that power setting, and of course we're going to run it for quite a bit longer than that. But anyway, my strategy with the throttle on the start, when he says, "Gentlemen, you have a race," it's all the way to the wall and it stays there, and I'm bending it. I'm actually probably bending that throttle a little bit too, because if I could get more, I'd want more, as long as the temperatures and the pressures and things are going to stay within limits. It's really interesting because if you are behind somebody and you're trying to pass him and you've got, let's say, 3 to 5 miles an hour advantage on him, you're probably not going to be able to get by him. Because when you look at what happens at the turns, if he's or she is flying the right kind of race course, they're going to be kind of tight on the pylons. You are going to have to fly a longer course because you're slightly to the outside. So you're going to be flying a longer track. And if you don't have, I don't know, I'm thinking 8 or 10 miles an hour on him, there's a very good chance that you're not going to get by unless he does something wrong and you get an advantage because he's done something wrong on it. So passing is very, very difficult without a pretty significant speed advantage. And what you're going to wind up doing is a lot of very, very close formation flying, trying to hope that he does something wrong and you can sneak on by, but you'll wind up right there just on the outside of him, trying to work to the inside anytime you can. The rules on passing, you may not ever pass on the inside of the turn. You must pass to the outside, and you must pass above another airplane on the race course. So when you don't do those kinds of things, mid-airs happen. And so they're very, very strict on those sorts of things.
Anybody have a question over there?
There's one over here.
Well, John's got a mic over there.
Personally, what was your call sign in the Navy, and where did the name Hoot come from?
Oh, wow. Well, gee, the same answer. My call sign was Hoot in the Navy. And I tell people that the nickname Hoot came from the expression, "not worth a hoot." Actually, no, it actually didn't come from there, but with the last name of Gibson, you're going to get Hoot Gibson for a nickname because of the old movie star cowboy. And so I picked that up when I got to my first fighter squadron, the ops officer, and it was a F-4 Phantom squadron. The ops officer looked at me and he said, "Okay, kid, you got a nickname?" And my first name is Robert, so I said, "Well, yes, sir, it's Bob." And he says, "No, come on, I mean a real nickname." And I said, "Well, occasionally as a kid over the years, I've been called Hoot. Bang, that was it. That was 1971, and I've not been anything else since then. Well, my wife has some other ones, but since then, I have not been anything but Hoot since 1971.
That's a naval
Yes, sir.
tradition, by the way, and I think the Air Force has adopted that tradition now.
Yeah, they have. You will get a nickname that's a unique kind of nickname, because in a dogfight, my wingman on my last cruise, his call sign was Bear, and so it was Bear Hoot, come right, or Bear Hoot, I need you to go up, and that kind of thing. If you're just using your nickname, you'd say, Jim, this is Bill, and you go, well, which Jim, which Bill? Because you might have multiple names like those, but with a unique call sign, it really is functional both in the air and on the ground as well.
It's a good idea. Someone else had a question here? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hoot, relating to Charlie Hillard's accident, how much of a tendency does this airplane have to raise a tail and nose over on ground handling?
That's a very, very good question, and it was regarding Charlie Hilliard's tragic accident in almost the same exact airplane as this. The airplane with the 3350 in it does have a heavy nose, and you look at all this engine mass sitting up forward. The gear, you can see the landing gear, the main gear, is swept forward, and that's an attempt to get a little bit more stability and a little bit less nose over tendency. But if you're taxiing at a half decent clip and you stomp on your brakes, you're going to put it on its nose. It's very easy to do that. Charlie's airplane had perhaps even more of a disadvantage. He had a lot smaller main gear, wheels, and tires. He had, I guess they were P80, F80, P80 tires and brakes on his airplane. This one has, I think these are F102. Somebody told me these are F102 tires and brakes, and so they're bigger, and they are, I think, a little bit less grabby and a little bit less finicky than the little tiny P80 tires are. But you do have to watch this thing on the ground because it does have a heavy nose. The other thing is we also have a little bit more ballast weight in the tail than what I think Charlie had in his airplane. Charlie, I think, had 50 or 70 pounds of lead in the tail. We have about 150 pounds in the tail. And so that's a big help. But yeah, you definitely have to watch it because you can put it on its nose.
Anybody else?
Danny?
Okay, we have one over here.
Hoot, how many shuttle missions have you made?
I got to go 5 times. I flew, my first launch was the 10th launch of a space shuttle, which was aboard Challenger in 1984. And then I flew the last mission before the Challenger accident, so I flew the only launch that went in 1986 and came back because 10 days after I landed was when we lost the Challenger. That was on Columbia. And then I worked on the redesign of the booster rockets. I was the lead astronaut to the redesigned team. And so my boss said, okay, you like those new boosters so much, go fly them. So I got to do the second launch when we started up again, and that was aboard Atlantis. I flew the 50th Space Shuttle launch, 1992, aboard Endeavour. So I've got 4 of the 5 space shuttles at that point. All I needed to do was fly Discovery, and I'd have had all 5. But instead, they made me go on Atlantis again, which I shouldn't be complaining about, I realize. But I flew on Atlantis and got to do the first docking with the Russians on the space station Mir. And that was an interesting challenge because I had 2 Russians on my crew, and they couldn't speak much of any English. And they also really couldn't afford to hire English teachers or buy English textbooks because Russia is kind of economically difficult these days. And so we had to make the effort to learn Russian because you really needed to be able to turn to them and say, "Izviniche, pожалуйста, у нас есть маленький пожар на борту," which is, "Excuse me, please, but we have a small fire on board." So, if you really needed to talk to them, you really needed to talk to them. So we had to make the effort to learn to speak Russian, and I'm not very good at it, but I can still carry on a little bit of a conversation in Russian if it's a real easy conversation.
Let's take a short pause here. Let them shut down the B-25.
These darn Warbirds are too noisy.
It's a beautiful sound.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, you know, I think it was in the early 90s. I'll get him in just a second.
Okay.
Back in the early 90s, we had all the Apollo astronauts up here at Oshkosh. And the thing that really impressed me when they did the bios was the education. And I believe you have a degree from Cal Poly in astrophysics or something
Actually,
similar.
aerospace engineering, aeronautical
Aerospace
engineering.
And, you know, these guys are so highly educated and so motivated that we really owe our astronauts a big round of applause right now.
Thank you.
And I'm so sorry to hear that we're having some more problems with the shuttle, but hopefully we'll get it back in the air soon.
Yeah, I guess to maybe just say a word or two about that. You know, we have it in orbit right now. We have Discovery up there, and unfortunately, some of the foam came off of that tank. After almost 3 years of effort to prevent that from happening, we have it in space now. There do not appear to be any safety concerns with bringing it back because the foam came off too late to cause a problem, fortunately. But it's really a disappointment when you say we have devoted the last couple of years to fixing this problem, and apparently we have not fixed it yet. So there's going to be quite a bit more effort, I'm sure, going on before we get to see it launch again.
Right. Okay, who had the question over here? Yes, sir.
Do you still fly the MiG? Tell us about the MiG.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's something we didn't mention. I am in the enviable position. I guess for everything I got to do, I'm in a rather enviable position. But one of the other things I used to get to do was fly the MiG-15 and the MiG-21, and I've flown both of those here at Oshkosh a number of times. And after all those years of having been a Cold Warrior, working in, as I mentioned, or as Dan mentioned, in the Vietnam War, and then as even longer than that as a Cold Warrior, it's been really fascinating to get to go fly this airplane that you had studied for so many years, studied what its advantages were, what its disadvantages were against us in a dogfight, and then to actually get to go fly the thing and see for yourself, is this true, is that true, were we briefed correctly on everything? And some of the things were accurate, some of the other things were not accurate. But it's been fascinating to get to fly the MiGs. I have not flown, I haven't flown a MiG-21 for, I guess it's about 2 years now since I've been out in it. That's by far one of my favorite airplanes. It's a lightweight fighter with a great big engine, doesn't carry a whole lot of fuel, but while you're up, man, it really goes. You can burn that whole tank of gas in a very quick amount of time. And when I was here flying the MiG-21 the last time, I got to do a air show routine in it. The air show routine was, I don't remember now, I think it was 12 minutes. The whole entire routine from brake release to off the runway and clear was 12 minutes. And I could eat up 70% of the fuel that was in that airplane. Of course, it's virtually all afterburner. And you could just suck up all your gas in a very short amount of time in that airplane. But what a neat airplane that is to fly.
Anyone else have a question? Yes, sir.
During the race at Reno, what percentage of the time could you make the runway in the event of a catastrophic engine failure?
Good question. Yeah, very good question. And the answer to it, I don't know if you could all hear the question. While you're racing, when can you make it to the runway? Reno is really set up nicely. You have 3 separate runways, 826, 1432, and then there's 1836. So those 3 runways are all inside the race course. So from any point on the race course, once you're up to speed, if you blow the engine, you can make a runway. And I got to practice that for real in 2000 when I sort of blew up the engine on Friday, in the heat race on Friday. We had a intake scoop that started to disintegrate and send blades down into the engine, and the The supercharger sat in there eating itself up, and then finally the engine said, I've had enough, and it just blew back out through the carburetor. The whole induction scoop exploded in front of me, and pieces went by, and I decided, okay, I guess I'm through with this race. And so I got to practice that. And what you're going to do, you're going to obviously transfer all of your kinetic energy into altitude. So you're going to zoom for altitude is what you're going to do, and then pick out a runway to go to. And in my case, I actually had way too much energy for the runway I was going to, so I wound up S-turning to bleed off some speed on down. But you can make a runway from anywhere on the race course. We actually practice that, and they encourage you to get out on the course on the practice days and practice doing an emergency approach. So pull the throttle off and zoom for altitude, throw your gear out and see how you would have done going for a particular runway. And that pays off, because when it's time to do it for real, you don't get to say, well, I almost made that runway, like you can in practice.
Okay, we'll take a couple of more questions, and then Hoot has to cut out of here. I want to give him enough time to sign autographs for a couple of minutes or whatever. So let's take one or two more questions. John?
Hoot, I'm going to call you the kid because you are the young generation. But on the space shuttle, with the problems we have encountered with the tiles, has there been any studies made why we can't replace those tiles while we docked up in space?
Good question. Yeah, and the question is, we're having all this trouble with the heat shield, the tiles, and actually some other areas on the shuttle. Why can't we replace them in orbit? They have been working on that, and I don't know everything that they've studied so far or that they have done. It's a difficult problem to work on the underside of the shuttle where the heat shield is, because there's no handholds down there. There's nothing to grab a hold of, nothing to hang on to. Now, you could work it with the arm, where you'd put an astronaut on the end of the arm and swing them underneath and kind of move them into position. They have worked on developing that capability to actually repair the tiles on orbit. They're not there yet. So we still are going to depend very heavily on debris not coming loose during launch and damaging it, because we really can't repair it just yet. And I believe they're still working on the capability, but we're not there yet.
Okay, let's have one more question. This gentleman right here.
Hoot, personally, and I know you have to maybe be politically correct, as far as the
No, I don't.
As far as the Challenger accident, they talked about putting an escape pod in there for the crew. Did that actually happen? And with what happened with the other shuttle, are they going to pursue that? Are they going to try and pull away from the shuttle? What's your personal feeling about that?
Okay, let's see. The question was on the Challenger accident, escape pod and that sort of thing. Well, you know, the one big mistake, in my opinion, this is my opinion, the one big mistake we made in the space shuttle program was that we got deluded when we were designing it and said it's going to be so safe, it's going to be so reliable, it's going to be so repeatable that we don't need an emergency escape system. And so we did not put a capsule-type ejection system on that, and that now has cost us 2 crews. It cost us the Challenger crew, and it cost us the Columbia crew. If we had had an escape pod of some sort that would come down with a parachute, we could have saved both of those crews. We still would have lost both of those vehicles, but we could have saved both of those crews. So I think we made a big mistake doing that. The first 2 times I flew the space shuttle, you're flying this machine that will go 17,000 miles an hour, and it'll fly 300 miles up. We didn't even have so much as a parachute on it. We didn't have even a lightweight parachute that you wore. We didn't wear a pressure suit. We didn't have a life raft on the thing. We didn't have any of that stuff, and it was because, once again, we let our beliefs, we let our public affairs get out of control, and we said we're not going to need any of those things. After Challenger, the Rogers Commission said you should put in place a capability to at least bail out of a gliding space shuttle if you can get it back down to gliding flight. So that means pressure suits, that means parachutes, one-man life rafts, and so we carry all that stuff now. Obviously, it didn't help us a bit in the Columbia accident. That didn't help us a bit. We had every bit of that on board Columbia, and that didn't save us. So we really needed an escape pod. We should have had an escape pod on in the first place. And had we had what we have now, the pressure suits and the parachutes, we could have saved the Challenger crew, because they were not killed by the breakup, and it was not really an explosion. You'll hear the expression Challenger exploded. It really didn't explode, it broke up, and it broke up into a whole bunch of pieces. The crew could not maintain consciousness at that high an altitude, and the crew actually died on water impact. But we firmly believe that they were all unconscious when that happened, because there's no way they could have maintained consciousness that high. So that's, in my opinion, like I say, the one big mistake we made in the space shuttle program was not having that emergency escape system.
Well, since I have the mic, I get to ask the last couple of questions. Who is the biggest influence on your life? What person?
Well, gee, it was my flight instructor, who was also a test pilot and an aeronautical engineer, and that was my dad. And in fact, 2 years ago, I was inducted into the Astronaut Hall of Fame, and so I had the opportunity to say in my little speech that I got to make there, if I have been successful as a pilot, it's because I had the best teacher that anybody could ever have, and that was my dad. So I got to make that particular speech a couple of years ago, and he was, like I say, he was a aeronautical engineer and a test pilot, and so I knew from the time I was about 10 years old that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot, and so my goal had not been to fly in space. My goal had been to be a test pilot, and I had actually reached that in the mid-'70s when I got to go be a test pilot and go through the Navy's test pilot school. And then it just got even better because I got to go fly the rockets after that. So I really thank Dad for everything he showed me and things he taught me.
The last question I have for you is one I ask every pilot that I interview, is if the good Lord says, Hoot, you got one more flight, which aircraft or spacecraft is it going to be in your case, and why?
Can I make it a space shuttle because it takes so long to get ready for it? And
Good point.
That'll give me just a little bit more time?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, that's the one I'll pick then.
Well, how many veterans do we have in the audience? Thank you all for your service. Thank you for 40 years of service to our country. Thank you for being here today. And, man, we enjoyed this very much. Hoot Gibson.
Thank you. Me too. I enjoyed it.
We were made for grass, made to feel the joy of each and every blade, between our toes, across our backs, to run over its hills, marvel at its beauty, and find comfort in its stillness. We were made for grass. It's where we battled and celebrated, built monuments, grew families, forged memories, and pushed ourselves farther than ever before. We were made for grass, to care for, nurture, and cultivate. We've always made sure to have a patch of our own, because there's no greater feeling than being on the grass. Except
STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. 'Cause 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 ' STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. So we launched Challenger January the 28th, 1986. It took us nearly 3 years to redesign, recertify, rebuild, and we went through everything on the shuttle, not just the solid rocket boosters, which caused the accident. We had to redesign those and recertify them for flight. And the folks out in Utah, Morton Thiokol, and Thiokol Incorporated, just did such a brilliant job on the redesign and the way we mechanized the booster rockets after Challenger, that we had just about zero problems with the booster rockets for the whole rest of the space shuttle program. But we had to go through everything, not just the booster rockets, the external tank, the orbiter, everything about it. And then we were finally ready to launch again. And the first launch was Discovery, launched in September of 1988. And then I got assigned to command the second launch, STS-27 aboard Atlantis. And that was kind of interesting because I flew the last successful launch before Challenger, before the Challenger accident. And then I flew the second launch after we started up again. I almost flew back-to-back missions. And we were a top secret, classified Department of Defense mission. So to this day, if I told you what we carried, you could never leave this hangar.
So go ahead. I don't want to leave.
Never had anybody tell me that before.
Careful what you wish for.
But yes, it was a top secret classified mission, and one of the fascinating things about it was that my crew and I got briefed into what our capabilities in space are in terms of the military. And again, it's not weaponry. We don't put weapons in space, so it's not weaponry. But it's intelligence gathering, it's surveillance. And so we were the second launch after Challenger accident, after Discovery had flown in September. We launched on December the 2nd of 1988. So it took us almost exactly 3 years to redesign and rebuild. And it was interesting being a top secret mission because there was a ton of press and media interest in the flight before mine, STS-26. And now here comes a top secret mission. Don't try to ask us any questions because we won't tell you anything. We can't cover what we're covering on this mission. And we're trying to avoid the press. And the press was just ferociously interested in anything space shuttle after the Challenger accident. In fact, the press had changed overnight. Prior to Challenger, the press talked about NASA and they said, okay, well, NASA says they're going to do this and they're NASA, so they will do it and they'll make it work. They'll pull it off. That'll be we're forecasting success already. After Challenger, they flip-flopped. They were the opposite. It seemed like no matter what we were doing, they questioned it all. They were not agreeing that we were just going to go accomplish what we were going to go accomplish. But even so, they sure wanted to be there for every little thing on the mission. So we actually tried to launch on December the 1st of 1988, and the winds up at altitude were raging. So this was December, so we've got winter winds up there. And the jet stream during launch looks like 140 mile an hour wind shear to us, because here's our jet stream flowing along from west to east, and here we come up in our shuttle, and by the time we got to where the jet stream was, we're going fast. We're probably up to Mach 2 at least. And so it looks like a sudden wind shear. So December the 1st, we had winds that were out of limits. We can launch if our structural indicators say we've got 100% design load. We can launch at 100%. We can't launch at 101% design load. So on December the 2nd, we sat on the launch pad for about 4.5 hours and used up the whole entire launch window hoping for the winds to die down. And right about the end, when it looked like we're not going to get to launch today either, the winds died down enough to where they concluded that we are at 100% design load. Okay, we can launch. So we launched, and we had very little time left. I want to say seconds, maybe 30 seconds left in the launch window. So we just barely made it into space that day. Unbeknownst to us, during the launch, the nose cap of the right-hand booster rocket, that's the big white rocket that's on the side of the thing, the nose cap has a coating of ablative material on it, and the ablative material obviously wasn't strong enough. It broke loose, and pieces of it showered my right wing on Atlantis. So, of course, we couldn't see any of that. But the ground always goes through all the launch footage, all the movies, all the stills, everything, to look for this sort of thing. So the next day, after we had gone to orbit, and on the first day, we deployed a major new intelligence satellite for the United States. And that's about as much as I'm allowed to say about it. Even to this day. This was 1988. So what's that, 34 years ago? And I'm still not allowed to say what it was we carried, but I am allowed to say it was a major new intelligence satellite. Mission Control called us and said, hey, Hoot, during launch we saw something hit your right wing. We want you to take the robot arm, which is, they call it the RMS, the Remote Manipulator System. It has a television camera on the end of it as part of the system. Said, we want you to hang it over the right side of the orbiter and look at your right wing and tell us what you see. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are going to die, because we could see a vast amount of tile damage on the right wing. So I keyed the mic, and I told the Capcom, if I remember right, the capsule communicator, or Capcom, was Dave Hilmers. And I called him and I said, Dave, we're seeing a lot of tile damage on the right wing. And he said, okay, we'll get back to you. So they went away for a while, and it turned out Department of Defense didn't want any video coming down, just in case we would have the death ray in the picture. Okay, we didn't have a death ray. Just in case there would be something classified.
The flux capacitor.
Yeah, the flux capacitor, like, from Back to the Future. Yeah. Yes. So DOD didn't want anything, video, any kind of imagery at all coming down from the mission. And in fact, every photograph that we shot over the whole course of it was only 4.5 days. But one of the goals that you had as a shuttle crew was to shoot up every frame of film that you had on board. You didn't want to come back and land with any unexposed film. But DOD had to go through every single frame with a microscope and make sure there was nothing classified that accidentally showed up in any of these things. So, for example, a shot looking out the window of the Earth and a particular point on the Earth, if somehow the time of that frame showed up in the frame, that was going to be a classified item, because where we were at any particular time was going to be secret, although you could pretty well tell where we were. But anyway, so DOD finally relented and said, okay, since you really need to take a look at your right wing, we'll let you send down encrypted video. Okay, well, encrypted video isn't very good. It doesn't have very good resolution. And I guess what it does, it shoots a frame, and it takes about 3 seconds to encrypt it and record it, and then another frame, another 3 seconds. So the resolution was so poor that down on the ground, unbeknownst to us, Mission Control looked at it and said, that's not tile damage, that's just lighting and shadows that these boys are looking at. Hoot's all screwed up. Well, did they ever tell us that? No. They came back, I guess after 24 hours, because I think they looked at it for a full day before they came back. And Dave Hilmers called and said, okay, hey, Hoot, we've got the resolution on your tiles. And I said, okay, yeah, great, go ahead, Dave, what? He said, it's no problem, just re-enter just like we always do. Well, I was incredulous. I couldn't believe it. And I keyed the mic and I said, Dave, what are they basing that on? And he said, okay, well, stand by, because he had to get the rationale from the engineers and all. And he came back about 10 minutes later and he said, Hoot, they looked at it and they said it's no worse than what we've seen on other missions. Notice they did not say, we don't think you're seeing tile damage. We think you're just seeing lighting and shadowing. They didn't say that. So this is called a failure to communicate. Now, I think I was communicating because I said, Dave, we're seeing a lot of tile damage on that right wing. So they came back and said, it's no worse than what we've seen before. Well, I said, well, you know what? I've been here since before STS-1, the first shuttle launch, and I've never seen anything like this. And then I did something that I shouldn't have done. I kind of gave in. I said, okay, but you guys are the experts. I should have dug my heels in and said, hey, let's talk about this, because I'm definitely seeing serious tile damage. But I think the big failure to communicate was on mission control. They never said to me, you are not seeing tile damage. Hoot, you're just messed up. It's just lights and shadows. Because if they had done that, I would have said, okay, I'm sending you clear TV, because I'm definitely seeing tile damage. But I caved in because it was always, and still is, considered bad form for an astronaut to get into an argument with mission control. In fact, it's career limiting for you to get into a contest, a fighting contest with mission control. So I gave in, and I shouldn't have. I should have made them talk about it some more. And so there were some funny things that came out of it. The night before re-entry, I remember one of the astronauts was talking about how he was a little bit more than nervous about this re-entry tomorrow. And I said to him, oh, come on, don't feel that way. No use dying all tensed up. And so, this is fighter pilot humor, or gallows humor.
Gallows humor.
And however, all the way down on re-entry, I was watching the elevons. I can see right where the left elevons are and where the right elevons are on my display. And I knew that if we started to burn through the right wing, what I would see is we would build up more drag on that right wing. And to balance the amount of drag, the left elevon would be going down. And that creates drag. That's how we create drag with an elevon at this 40-degree angle of attack that we fly re-entry at. And so all the way down, I have the audio that I made from the re-entry, that we made, the crew made for the re-entry. And all the way down in the atmosphere, about every 2 minutes, I'd say, guys, the controls look good. The elevons look good. So we watched them all the way down, because I knew what I'd see is I'd see a split. The right elevons would be going up. The left elevons would be going down. Oh, an elevon is a combination aileron and elevator, so that's why it's called elevon. So that's what we have on the trailing edge of both wings. I'd see the right elevon going up and the left elevon going down. And if that happened, I knew that I might have 60 seconds to tell Mission Control what I thought of their analysis. But fortunately, all the way down, the elevons stayed matched. So that said to me, I'm pretty sure we're not burning through over on the right wing. But after we landed, there was amazement. There was absolute amazement. We had damaged 770 tiles. And I think 300 of them were serious damage to the tiles, chunks bigger than an inch that were chopped out of the tiles.
And just for perspective, what percentage of the tiles is 770?
It's not a real big percentage, but it was over on the right wing.
It's enough to destroy the shuttle.
Over on the right wing, oh, absolutely. And even more than that, John, we had one tile that was entirely missing, which we had not been able to see with the robot camera. with the RMS camera. We had not been able to see that we had one tile entirely gone, and we almost burned through at that location. We lucked out many, many ways that we came back at all, but we lucked out in that particular location where that tile had been mounted. There was a thick plate under it that had something to do with a ground plane antenna for the L-band system. So there was a thicker plate there, and it didn't burn through. If it had just been the regular aluminum surface, I suppose there's a chance that that might have burned through. And if that had happened, we might have been the Columbia accident on only the second launch after the Challenger accident. And if we had broken up at Mach 17, which is where Columbia broke up in 2003, if we had broken up at Mach 17, where were we? We were in the North Pacific, just south of the Aleutian Islands. We would have gone into the ocean when we broke up. There wouldn't have been much to find. That would have been the very end of us, of course, but it would have been the end of the shuttle program, because the discussion would have sounded like this. We gave you guys all this money to fix your space shuttles, and you lost the second launch after you started up again. It's the end. We can't afford to keep doing this. It would have been the end of the shuttle program. It would have been the end of us, of course. But where was the big mistake? The big mistake was Mission Control didn't tell us what they were thinking. We definitely told them what we were thinking. And that's an important lesson for leadership and for communication. Tell what you're thinking. And I gave in, and I shouldn't have done that. I should have said, hey, you need to talk to me a little bit more about this, because I'm pretty darn sure that I've never seen anything like this before. So I guess I'm partly to blame for us entering that way without knowing that Mission Control could have possibly looked at something. Maybe there was something we could do to fly a more gentle reentry. I don't know.
When you got down and saw that tile damage, did you have to keep your hands in your pockets to keep from punching somebody in the face?
Well, no, because, we wouldn't have known who to punch. There probably would have been too many people for us to punch. But in the debrief, this won't give us any great satisfaction whatsoever. I asked the lead ascent and entry flight director, who was responsible for mission control as the leadership in mission control. I asked him in the debrief, I said, okay, if you had listened to us and paid attention to what we were saying and realized that we did have serious tile damage, what do you suppose we could have done? And he said, I don't know. And that was as far as it went. So what did we do after STS-27? The only thing we fixed after STS-27 was we went to a stronger ablative. Remember several minutes ago I mentioned the ablative on the nose cone of the right booster rocket disintegrated. They went to a stronger ablative, so we had no more problems with that ever again.
I don't know what an ablative is.
Oh, that's a material that will erode under real high temperature and burn off very gradually. All the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft had an ablative heat shield. So it would burn and char, and then the char would break away, and then the next layer would burn and char and break away. And that was how you protected the aluminum surface of the vehicle. So that was to protect the booster rocket nose caps, because those could be reused. So, or just to protect, I'm not sure those can be reused, but it was to protect the rate gyros and things that would be up in the nose cone of the booster rocket. We went to a stronger ablative. We did not say, okay, if this happens again, we had to repair some tiles or repair a missing tile. Could we do that? We had looked at it very briefly. NASA had looked at it very briefly before the first shuttle launch, STS-1, because after the trouble we had flying Columbia from California to Florida and had all these tiles come loose, there was talk about, okay, what if we get up there in space and there's a bunch of missing tiles? Can we come up with a putty that we could putty up that gap That was done a little bit before STS-1, but then we saw that our tiles worked okay, so we never did anything else about it. So even after we had lost a tile, we never looked into what could we do to replace a tile on orbit. So we weren't prepared for this, and we weren't prepared when we lost Columbia either. And we didn't look into Columbia as thoroughly as we should have. Maybe there was something that we could have done.